Keep going to thank our partners who make this all possible. First of all, our presenting sponsor, National Guardian Life. Hosting sponsor, again, the Eastside Club. Supporting sponsors, Johnson Financial Group, Alliant Energy, Perfect Speed. It's also not possible with other wonderful organizations in our community like UW Extension and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. Our media partner, WQOW, unfortunately Dana could not be today. She was traveling to see family. Additional support from other organizations on our website. Turn the it says, aha, I sort of laugh. Coming up in a few weeks is Frozen Assets. It's a multi-day celebration of our lakes. And we do something new this year. So you can get out their phone, get a little piece of paper, and write down the date of Wednesday, February 4th. More pens out, and this guy, look, he's taking a picture of it. There you go. We're actually doing a happy hour summit. The county executive, along with all the mayors in our community, are going to be doing a forum talking about the lakes and what our individual communities are doing. There'll be a lively discussion. There's appetizers and drinks and all those wonderful things that come with a happy hour. And we do expect a nice crowd. And so that will be at the Edgewater, kicking off our Frozen Assets. Continuing on is the festival that weekend. So educational components, the Frozen Assets run walk on the lake, the only run walk completely on a lake in the entire world. So we're excited about that. It's a wonderful entry point for people to get excited and embrace their frozen lakes. If you're wondering about lake depth for the ice, I will be out measuring it sometime next week after we have a few days of really cold Wisconsin weather. I don't think I'd go out on the lake today because if you look to your right, everybody's been to the right, but Lake Monona is now open. You can go to climatologist.org to learn more about that. Turn the page again. Back to today's talk, we're excited to have Dr. Steve Vavrus from UW present on today's talk. Steve is the director of the Wisconsin Climatology Office and is senior science specialist at UW-Madison Division of Extension and the Nelson Institute Center for Climatic Research. He's an expert on Wisconsin climatology, extreme weather, global impact changes, and the Arctic climate. He's earned a bachelor's degree and PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and received a bachelor's degree in meteorology from Purdue University. Here today to share is Dr. Steve.
Well, thank you for that introduction, James, and thanks for this great turnout. I've never been in the Eastside Club before, so I was surprised to see the lake so close by. I was dismayed that it's so open, but that's the way it's been lately. The image that you saw coming in was a lot prettier than this one. I didn't realize that I was going to get shown up with algae and zebra mussels on this one, but it does characterize one of the reasons we're here is to talk about these things. Things aren't always a perfect world. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir here when I talk about the importance of lakes for Madison. I moved to Madison from Indiana, or the Madison-Area in 1990 and lived here ever since. And to me, the three things that stand out when I think about Madison is capital, the university, and the lakes. Not necessarily in that order, but those are the three most iconic images or items when I think about this city. So it's of great importance, obviously, that we're having this kind of discussion. And we want to talk today, have a discussion about climate and how climate is affecting our lakes. And there is a lot that I could cover on that topic, obviously, but I only have about 45 minutes, I'm told. And so I selected these four that I think are probably the most important. One being the overall long-term warming trend, going way, way back, as I'll show. Another one is what we've been experiencing this winter and the last 24 hours, flickering winters. So we know the winter's here, the winter's gone, it comes back again like a faulty light bulb. It's not disappeared, but it's not fully on either. More extreme precipitation. I've been harping on this, as have others, in a warming climate. We'll talk about that and why we're expecting more extreme precipitation. And then of importance for the lakes in particular is more runoff during winter, spring. And that is also related to the flickering winter point. So with those items in mind, that gives us a framework for this question of how exactly has our climate been changing and what is in store for the future. So that's what I'll be covering for the next 40 minutes or so. So I am going to go into full-blown mode here with in the beginning, but I'm not going to go back that far to the beginning, but I am going to go back 30,000 years. And because the story of the Yahara Lakes really begins there. I came across a really nice blog recently when I was putting this talk together by a student or former student named Julia Buskirk, who you can go to the full blog, but it describes the history, the glacial history that created the Yahara Lakes. It's very accessible and it has these beautiful images in it, which I'm borrowing now. So way back when, 30,000 years ago, the lakes did not exist, but you can see in the outline there where they were in those dashed red colors. And this was the pre-glacial Yahara River Valley. And so obviously we didn't have clean lake salines back then, but things changed. And a little thing called the glacial maximum happened about 20,000 years ago when the glaciers came down from Canada, ended up covering most of Wisconsin, including Madison. The driftless area was spared, but the glacier was, and so forth. And because of these glaciers that the lakes formed. And so this is how it looked at the maximum extent about 15, 16,000 years ago in Madison. You can see the Yahara River covered up, no lakes yet. But then when the lakes did start melting, it created this one big glacial lake Yahara. So not just four lakes, but a single one, unifying them. And then with some down cutting and erosion over time, we ended up getting the familiar four lakes that we're used to now. You know, a river runs through it, right? The Yahara River is the thing, an ancient system that is still with us. So we have the past and the present with us. So in terms of this question, how does climate change affect our lakes? Well, you can't get more than it created the lakes in the first place. And you know, this is ancient climate change, and we'll talk more about contemporary climate change, but in spite of that, the climate created the lakes in the first place. But coming to the present, we've had a lot of warming since 15,000 years in the past, and that's not news to any of us, right? One of the disadvantages of giving this talk so early in the year is we don't have the full data yet for the previous year, for 2025. So I'm going to do the next best thing and show 2024 as an example. This is how the world looked in terms of its abnormal warmth in 2024. It was the warmest year on record globally and in the United States and in Wisconsin. 2024 was a record. And you see here the map of how much of normal temperatures were, all the colors, including North America. And you're really hard pressed to find any spots in the world that were cooler than normal in 2024. And to look back, to put that in perspective and to show that I didn't just pick a warm year, we have good global temperature records dating back to the middle 1800s. And that's what I'm showing in this graphic. You can see the individual years listed in the black dots and connected with that purple curve. And then that red line is the more or less the long-term trend. So if you just smooth out some of these year-to-year variations, you end up seeing the real changes over time. And one thing that stands out is that things were pretty flat in terms of the temperature change back in the 1800s to early 1900s. And then it really wasn't until the 1970s when things really ramped up. And you can just see this inflection point here. And ever since then, it's just this big mountain that we've been going up, culminating in 2024 at the end. And close second was 2023. I just heard this morning that 2025 is going to go down the warmest year on record. So the top three in the most recent 3 years, and at least two of them have been above this threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial average. And that matters because a lot of climate experts say that that's when we'll start to see the worst impacts of climate change, the consequences. So that's where we are, and it stands to reason that if the climate, the atmosphere is warmed that much, then so too have our lakes. And that's definitely what the data are showing. This is a graphic showing a 40-year period from 1981 to 2020 from a study done a couple, 3 years ago now. And any areas shown in red around the world indicate that these are areas where the lakes are getting warmer during that period. And you'll see that almost true, that I said, one spot, parts of Eurasia showing some blue, but also notice the farther north we climb, pretty much the redder it gets. So the Arctic amplification of global climate change is alive and well. Canada, Scandinavia, northern Russia, and so forth. So, you know, our lakes are warming, lakes all over the world are warming as a consequence of climate change. Now, closer to home, we have records, really good records, actually going back to the 1870s for Madison. And we have records from the airport, the Dane County Regional Airport, starting in 1940. And so I constructed this graphic that shows the average decadal temperature change in Madison for the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and so on. And what it shows is a couple of things. One is that the 1940s and 50s were actually a little bit on the warm side before we had a cool down in the 1960s. But ever since then, there's been just a gradual monotonic increase in temperature right here in Madison. So I was born in the 1960s. I've only experienced this warming trend in Madison. The 2010s were the warmest decade on record in Madison. I think that shows up pretty clearly. But we're in the 2020s now. In fact, we're more than halfway through the 2020s. And I started wondering, well, where are we right now? More than halfway through. And I have to say, I was pretty surprised to see that we are up there. We are literally off the chart in terms of how warm Madison has been. I've done the same sort of thing for Wisconsin as a whole, and it has the same effect. But we are way up here, 48.8, and pretty much the highest decade before was about 47.8, and that was a record breaker. So we need to cool down a lot the rest of this decade if this is not going to turn out to be a new record warmth for Madison in the 2020s. We can do the same exercise for precipitation in Madison, and that actually has been a more striking change or trend. You see, starting in the 1940s, that was a very dry decade, only about 28 inches of annual precipitation in Madison. We did have a bit of a bump up in the 1950s, but then ever since then, from the 60s onward, it's just been getting wetter and wetter and wetter. And we had the wettest decade on record in the 2010s, not only in Madison, but also in Wisconsin. And, you know, this helps to put it on a human timescale. You know, there's plenty of people in Madison who were born in, say, 1940, who have lived here their whole lives. And you just get a sense of how different the climate is that they've experienced when they were a kid compared with nowadays. We can do the same exercise, asking ourselves where we are in the 2020s, and we see it's not as dramatic a change, fortunately, or we're going to turn into Louisiana pretty soon. But we're still wet. This is where we land. 35 inches per year is what we've averaged in the 2020s. And it turns out that that's exactly the same as what we averaged in the 1990s. The 1990s were wetter than any decade preceding it. So we're still getting warmer, we're still getting wetter, but the 2020s have not been as wet as the previous decade or two. It's not just the total precipitation that matters, right? We talk about runoff into the lakes. What matters is the dosage, how heavy the rainfalls or snowfalls and snowmelts are. And one of the consequences of a warmer climate is that we fully expect there to be more intense rainfalls, in some cases snowfalls, when we get precipitation events. And the reason is fairly simple. This is basic earth science. This figure could be read out of an earth science textbook, just showing how the water cycle works. We get evaporation from the ground, from lakes, streams, crops, forests, and so on. That moisture gets into the atmosphere, and some of it condenses into clouds. Some of the clouds turn to rain or snow. Precipitation falls, we get runoff, and then that infiltrates groundwater and streams and lakes and so on. So it completes the cycle. All of this water cycle is true in a warming climate, except everything speeds up. So all of these components are working in overdrive. We tend to get more evaporation in a warmer climate. The precipitation, when it falls, because there's more moisture in the atmosphere, can fall in heavier doses. And then, of course, that leads to more runoff, more flooding, and so on, in case of the lakes, nutrient runoff. And we know that this is happening more in a warming climate because there's data across the country and around the world that shows this. Here's an example of the trend in the heaviest downpours in recent decades, from the late 1950s to the early 2020s. This is the rainfall or snowfall on the heaviest 1% of all days. So wherever you are in the country, pick the top 1% of heavy events, and we're looking at the trend in that. And you can see that it's positive everywhere in all sectors of the country, especially so right here in the upper Midwest, and even more so in the Northeast. But we're at close to 50% increase over this time period. And we even have data closer to home here in Wisconsin that shows this clearly. Those 20 teens, the years that are so wet around here, we had more than 20 of the so-called 100-year daily rainfalls. And by that, I mean that these are rainfalls of an intensity that are so great that we only expect them to happen once per century on average, or you could say a 1 in 100 chance in any given year. So 21 of these in the very wet decade of the 20 teens, and you can see where those occurred. They were pretty much all over the state. And the heaviest one, if you have quick eyes, you can spot the very heaviest one of all, which unfortunately we have the honor of in Dane County. How many people were around and remember this event? Oh yeah, oh boy, a lot of people. Okay, yeah, so you'll never forget that one, especially if you're on the west side. So this is the infamous flooding in August of 2018. And the rainfall amounts are shown here. These are derived estimates in blue. And these are not, this would be a lot of snowfall in inches, right? But it was rainfall in one day. It was staggering. And one of the reasons I'm showing it is because despite the impact that had on our lakes, and there was quite a bit of flooding afterwards, it really could have been a direct hit. I mean, if not for good luck, that blob, if it had just been a few miles east, it would have been a direct hit right on the isthmus, right over the Yahara lakes. So, we need to consider that was a close call, even though it did have major impacts. And speaking of close calls, there was an even bigger one that hit Milwaukee this summer in August 9th, 10th. This wasn't a 100-year rainfall. This was a 1,000-year rainfall. A new Wisconsin daily record, 24-hour record, 14.5 inches of rain fell on the north side of Milwaukee. All been verified. Ed Hopkins from our office was part of the team that verified it. And just as an aside, even though it's a 24-hour record officially, almost all of it fell within 10 hours. So you think about that, that's like 1.5 inches of rain per hour sustained for 10 straight hours. It's just mind-boggling. And maybe not a surprise then, the damage was enormous. And a colleague just sent an article saying that FEMA has already issued nearly $200 million in assistance to the 3 counties that were hit the hardest around Milwaukee. So, hopefully we're not going to see anything like this again, but this trend toward heavier rainfalls is real, and it has implications for runoff into our area lakes. But we can't change the past. We can learn from it. These are great stress tests for us to figure out what's safe and what isn't. But we do want to get a glimpse of where we're likely to head into the future. And for that, we can turn to the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, their outlooks, their climate model projections for Wisconsin. And this is an example of that for the late century, an estimate of where we're heading in terms of temperature. What's shown here is the average for the 2080s and 2090s, so the end of this century, versus a reference period from the 1990s through 2020. So basically the climate we've gotten used to compared with the climate that's coming. And boy, all of these are bright red colors or brown colors. They're all warm colors. They're all indicating some major temperature changes, anywhere statewide averages on the order of 9, 10, even up to 11 degrees warming, Fahrenheit warming. And you see that winter is the season that's expected to warm the very most. And a lot of that is because of reduced snow cover, which chills the climate. With a warmer climate, probably less snow cover and amplify warming during that season. But pretty much, if you're in Wisconsin, you're not going to escape the warming trend. And to first order, all the seasons are showing a similar amount of major warming expected. But what about precipitation? So, global warming, you'd expect the climate to warm, but precipitation is trickier, especially when we consider seasonal averages. What the climate models are saying is that winters and springs will become wetter. Significantly so, about 20% across most of the state, according to this scenario. That's also been the case up to now. Winter and springs have gotten noticeably wetter over time. The models are also saying autumn will probably get wetter too, but not by as much. And then something new here, but this is the latest round of climate model projections. They are now indicating that summers will probably get drier around the state. And that is different from the talk that I even gave, a month or two ago when the models were saying, we can't tell. Some say wetter, some say drier. Now they're saying strongly drier to the tune of 10 to 15% reductions in summer rainfall. So it will be interesting to see how ecosystems and lakes respond if 3 of those seasons get wetter and the other gets drier. But that is what they're indicating at this point. We might talk about that during the end here. But regardless of summer drying or the other seasons getting wetter on average, the models continue to be consistent that we'll see this trend toward more extreme rainfall when it happens. And here's an example showing a map of the past, the number of days of rainfall with 2 inches or more. So not, flood amounts, but even more modest than that, but 2 inches or more. On the left is the past conditions, how frequently, and the scale here is the number of days per decade. So the bluer the color, the more frequent these events. And you can see that they're most common in the southwest part of the state. And then the projection for the future by the end of the century, similar spatial pattern, still the heaviest or most common in the southwest, but everybody goes up by some amount. So the frequency, regardless of where you are, is expected to increase. And, you can pick your location, but the main result here is we're likely to get more of these extreme rainfalls coming up. Now, ultimately, what we care about is what are the impacts? So, as a climatologist, I'm interested in just the atmospheric changes by themselves, but the societal impacts are the ones that really is what matters ultimately. And for the purposes of today's discussion, I picked 3 that I thought were especially meaningful. One being lake ice, the second being water quality, and the third, the effects on fish species. So I'll go through those next. And the first slide is a nod to Dick Lathrop. I'm glad he's in the audience. He and John Magnuson coined this term years ago, lake ice, as a climatometer. So we all know what a thermometer is. It measures heat in the atmosphere over a given moment. But a climatometer means that lakes sort of integrate these temperature effects from day to day, week to week, month to month, and give an indication of what the weather has been like. So the fact that, Monona is half open is a testament to the fact that the last 2 days in particular have been exceedingly warm. And yet there's still some ice on the lake because right around New Year's, it was quite cold. So the lakes remember, and they can serve as a measure and inference proxy, if you will, for past weather variations. John Magnuson, in particular, about 25 years ago, was a pioneer in this, in using lake ice records from around the Northern Hemisphere to derive what kind of climate changes have been occurring over century timescales. And collected data from all these lakes and synthesized them and came up with this measure that showed that there's been a significant reduction in the amount of ice cover around the Northern Hemisphere, even as of 2000, before a lot of the warming is amplified since then. So the lakes are freezing later in the fall or winter and melting off earlier. Lake, as we'll see, Lake Mendota is no exception. And here is a beautiful image that John Magnuson lent me years ago, showing the day of ice formation back in 2007. And if you look carefully, it was January 20th, so it was really a late year in 07, a warm winter. And one of the real advantages of being in Madison and being at the university is Lake Mendota is called the most studied lake in the world. And one of the ways it's been studied is monitoring its ice cover. And this is a gold mine of information. This is the duration of ice cover on Lake Mendota going all the way back to the early 1850s. And we can infer different things. I mean, it's an example of a climatometer, but it's also a measure of year-to-year weather variability superimposed. So if we start at the beginning here in the 1850s and look at the number of days with ice cover on Mendota, we can see that it was typically around 120. So about 4 months of ice cover was typical on Mendota, but 3-year variations. And then over time, there's been a gradual decrease and then an unmistakable big decrease when we get into the 21st century. So at present, we average more like 3 months or often less than that compared to the 4 months we used to have. And to just bring this point home even more, if I pick the 5 winters that had the most ice cover on Mendota, they all were in the 1880s or earlier, that's the blue circles. And the 5 winters with the least ice cover were all in the 1980s or later, including the one just a couple winters ago that had the second shortest ice duration on record. And as an aside, another impact, economic impact that we don't think of, but if you are interested in history, Wisconsin used to rely heavily on lake ice for refrigeration. Before electric refrigerators, people said Wisconsin has some of the best ice in the country, so go Wisconsin. And Madison in particular was noted for its fine quality ice cover. In the left, you see this example from Lake Wingra over by Knickerbocker Place of this conveyor belt putting the lake ice that's been harvested and shipping off to rail cars to parts to our south that were colder, that were warmer. And then I also want to give a shout out here to Dr. Ed Hopkins, who's in the audience. His nickname is the Iceman in our office. He has been monitoring diligently our ice conditions on Monona, on Wingra, on Mendota for, well, not since 1852 when the ice record began, most likely, but I don't know when Ed began his monitoring. This picture was a part of the story that Carmen did for Clean Lakes Alliance a few years ago, and Ed is out. He was out even keeping track of the ice conditions. So some we need to, I guess, accept or adapt to is the fact that we may be seeing winters in the not too distant future when we cannot count on ice-covered lakes, at least not nearly as commonly as in the past. And, I think to me, probably to most of us, we consider that a sad prospect. All the winter recreation and aquatic impacts that lake ice has. But I did a modeling study a while back where I looked at the projections of temperature from these wiki climate models. And using a statistical lake ice model I developed a while ago, I put those projected temperatures for winter in from the climate models. And I first tested it to see in the past if the climate models accurately predicted the fact that there's a 100% chance that Lake Mendota will freeze every winter, and that worked. So that was a good check. And the model estimated that the duration of ice was 3 months. Great, just like observations. But looking out in by the middle of this century, at least a couple of the models were suggesting that ice will no longer be perennial, that there will be winters, maybe occasional winters, maybe 1 out of 10, where the ice is not going to form. It's going to be too warm for ice to completely cover Lake Mendota. And when it does, the duration will only be half as long. And then looking out further to the late century, all of the models are consistent in saying that we'll no longer have perennial ice cover on the lake, and 1/3 of the winters are expected to be ice-free by the end of the century. And on the winters when it does form, it'll likely only last for a month, and presumably be a lot thinner. So, we don't like to face this, but if this is where we're headed, we do need to prepare and we do need to adapt. And, these numbers are uncertain, obviously. We don't know exactly how much climate change there's going to be, but it is, I think, worth noting and worth, taking to heart that this is the direction we're heading. Now, one of the keeping with the winter theme, more toward water quality from lake ice, climate impact. This group, and Clean Lakes Alliance in particular, is well aware of this trend toward salinizing lakes. That's not unique to Madison, but we see it firsthand here. It's no secret that we tend as a society to oversalt, whether it's parking lots or roads or sidewalks. And we've all seen examples of it. The data show very clearly in the middle there, this increasing trend in higher salinity levels in our lakes. This graphic is a bit old now. It ends in 2012. I don't know what the very latest data show, but beginning in 1960, things are quite different nowadays than they were back then as a direct consequence of our salt habits. Getting back to that point of flickering winters. So one of the ways that salinization story is tied in with climate is that we're getting more of these freeze-thaw cycles in the winter. And we're actually measuring this in the State Climatology Office. We have a project looking at the number of hours spent above freezing or below freezing, because that's arguably the most important temperature threshold in the climate system. And of course, if you're above freezing, like yesterday, we're snow-free, we can even be ice-free. Below freezing, like today, that's when we can support a snow-covered lake ice and so on. Using data back to the middle 20th century, we've been looking at the trend across Wisconsin in the number of hours below freezing. And what it's showing over that roughly 75-year time period for the winter months is a pretty dramatic drop. In December, we're seeing about a 15% reduction in the number of hours below freezing. January is not quite as much, but about 10% reduction, 8% in February. But look at March, nearly a 20% reduction in the amount of time that we spend below freezing around the state, even to the point where I think you could make a good case that March used to be a winter month in Wisconsin, and it's become now a spring month as a result of the climate change. And when we get these warmer, above normal temperatures, like we did yesterday, that's when we can get winter rains, snow melt, and so on, that ultimately can put salt and other nutrients right into our lakes. Another example of water quality that is not winter-based, it's actually more summer-based, is the fact that higher temperatures can lead to reduction in oxygen levels at depths of lakes, which can affect fishes such as the Cisco. It's an example of work from Madeline McGee years ago, where she looked at the tracking the temperatures from the surface down to the depth of a lake. The warm colors are higher temperatures. And you can see that from January to December, you get the summer warm up, you get this layer of light, warm water, and that reduces, it inhibits mixing into the lake. And so you get a reduction in dissolved oxygen. And certain fishes like Cisco depend heavily on that oxygen level at depth. And the relationship to climate change is that warmer summers mean even a stronger warming of the surface, and also warmer shoulder months, meaning that this warm light layer of water can start earlier and last later into the fall. Another issue with water quality that we're all familiar with, we can see it by eye, is this tendency for precipitation and runoff, reducing water clarity and leading to harmful algal blooms when we get phosphorus runoff into the lakes. And it's so visible. Those of you who live in Madison are familiar with beach closures as a result of that phosphorus E. coli runoff. Because it is so visible, I think we appreciate the fact that it's risky, it's dangerous to our pets, it can be dangerous to us, but it's just a very visible reminder of a climate impact and a pollutant impact that we can see a lot more clearly than looking at, the water temperature of the surface of a lake that our eyes don't detect. But fortunately, there's been a lot of research on this. And one study in particular that caught my eye was led by Professor Steve Carpenter from the UW. And he and his team looked at and looked at the meaning of precipitation, runoff, meltwater, and phosphorus loading into Lake Mendota. And they found that precipitation and phosphorus runoff into the lake were correlated, not too surprising. But what's interesting is that they said that the highest phosphorus inputs occur in late winter and spring. They tried it to manure spraying largely, and that only about 1 month of the year accounts for 3/4 of the annual phosphorus load to Mendota. So I think that's great news, because now we know exactly the time to target. The entire year is treated equally. If we can improve conditions during this late winter, early spring period, we can have a disproportionately positive impact on water quality. And the climate tie to this is that winter and spring are especially important seasons for runoff. And here's several reasons why. One, snow melt. So we get, we build up the snow with flickering winters. It may come and go, but it's still there from time to time. Frozen ground, despite the warming climate, the ground still freezes around here in the winter. And when it does, and we do get surface melting, we can't infiltrate that water, and it tends to run off directly into streams and lakes. If there's manure on fields in the winter and we have snow melt or winter rain, frozen ground, that means that manure goes directly into the lakes with its phosphorus. And then, of course, wet soils. Now you have a greater source of water on the surface that can be transported with all the nutrients and pollutants that it's holding directly into our waterways. So this is all tied together with water quality and climate change. And then the final impact that I'll get into today is about fish species. And I am not a fish species expert, so I give you that caveat, disclaimer from the beginning here, but in looking at work that's been done by others in Wiki and elsewhere, there are some takeaways that I think are worth noting in terms of climate. So here's just an example about warming waters wreaking havoc with fisheries. And this is a nice graphic that was put together by Gretchen Hansen, a limnologist who studies fish species. and which ones thrive in warm waters and which ones do better in relatively cold waters. So this is well known. Certain species like bluegill and largemouth bass tend to do better when it's warmer. And other species, such as trout and walleye, tend not to do as well when it's warm. They like it cooler. It stands to reason that in a warming climate, there's going to be a shift. Species like bluegill and largemouth bass are probably going to do relatively better if the climate warms and the lakes warm, whereas the trout and the walleye are likely not to. And where she looked at what happened. Cool conditions, this is degree days, warmth over a season, and you go from a cool climate to a warm climate, and she found a comparison between walleye and largemouth bass. You have a cool climate, the walleye are happy, the largemouth bass are not. But as you go warmer and warmer, everything flips, and you have a much higher probability of largemouth bass at the expense of walleye. So these kind of exercises, these kind of studies are really useful for figuring out just how fish species are likely to respond to climate change and can even lead to some adaptation, proactive measures, perhaps, in terms of how we manage our lakes. Finally, I want to end with a bit more positive note, and that is, what are some ways that we can help lakes adapt to a changing climate? And this is kind of getting into the world of wiki, maybe good discussion topics. One in particular that's relevant for this point about heavier precipitation and runoff is that there is a lot we can do to mitigate and all the trees. This is not in terms of anything novel, but this is work that's been implemented elsewhere. Things like green roofs that help absorb heavy rainfall in urban areas. Cisterns and rain barrels is another way of helping to trap stormwater. Bioretention, so green infrastructure. There's a whole industry, so to speak, around how we can use natural climate solutions, green infrastructure for bioretention. These are all things that slow the flow of stormwater runoff. And when we do have urban areas and we have pavement, there are options for pervious pavement. So it looks like pavement, but actually rainwater can get through, and anything we can do to increase infiltration means that water is less susceptible to overland flow and a direct injection. And all this is being done in Madison and Dane County in reducing the pollution displaced. A couple of newer digesters have come on the scene in Dane County. The city of Madison has made to salt usage during the winter. I think 6% was their goal. Of course, there's a trade-off, right, between safety and water quality that we need to navigate. But I think it's really important that the city recognizes that this is a concern and that it's not going to get better unless we really deal with it directly. Dane County has the famous Suck Them Up campaign to take out phosphorus-laden sediments in our lakes. And time will tell how impactful that is, but it's been going on for a few years now. And then wetland protection is another great way. It's something that maybe is a little more invisible to us, but wetlands are natural pollution filters. And they also act like sponges when we have heavy rainfall events. So they help to keep that stormwater flow from zipping across the landscape so quickly and can trap pollution. I did mention Wiki a couple times. I do want to give a mention of Wisconsin climate change. Been around 20 years now. Cooperation between the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the UW-Madison Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. Of note, Wiki, if you're not familiar with it, we kind of sit at the interface between the science of climate change and the adaptation to climate change. And I want to give an announcement here that we are going to be having our new assessment report being released soon, as the balloon says. How soon? Well, really soon, like in the next couple months soon. So be on the lookout for that. This is going to be a more modest update of the 2021-2022 report, our most recent one. But as I showed, things have happened in the 2020s, like the warmest decade so far on record. So there is some new information that's worth absorbing here. And in particular, the Water Resources Working Group and the Fisheries Working Group within Wiki are especially relevant for today's conversation, and they'll be weighing in that report. Finally, to conclude, these are some of the main takeaways from today. From the climate angle, it's warmer and wetter, though that's what I've been talking about. Large temperature increases in all seasons. We've seen it already in Madison. We're expecting it throughout the state in the future. Likely that we'll see increased precipitation in the future in winter and spring, especially secondarily in autumn, but likely a reduction in summer rainfall. We can be pretty confident that we're going to be seeing more of these flickering winters in the future. And that means more cold rainfalls at the expense of snowfall, increased runoff, and more freeze-thaw cycles. Extreme rainfalls are very likely to become more common and heavier in all seasons. Climate models have been saying that for years. Some of the impacts I went over: reduced lake ice cover, additional nutrient salt and bacteria runoff. And then oxygen depletion will become an issue probably in the warmer months, and certain species of fish are more sensitive to that. And then, as one would expect, winds will become more favorable for some type of species and less hospitable for others. And finally, some adaptation strategies. I mentioned some stormwater runoff remediation strategies, finding ways to reduce the pollution sources into lakes in the first place, or reducing it and removing it through some of the up campaigns when it's there, protecting wetlands as natural filters. And then, because we're part of this Clean Lakes Alliance event, I also wanted to remind us that groups like Clean Lakes Alliance, Wisconsin Saltwise, and Wiki are not only good sources of information at the moment, but they also accommodate changes, the evolving knowledge on this topic. For instance, as I said, a month ago, I wasn't talking about drier summers in the future, but because of the evolving scientific nature of things, I now am using that as a theme. So being involved with groups like this is great, because you not only learn the state of the science at a given moment, but you'll stay in tune with how it evolves over time. So I will stop there, and hopefully we have time for questions and comments.
I want to thank Steve so much. Steve has been really instrumental in so many ways to the organization. Oh, by the way, I'm Paul Dierla. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Science Officer for Clean Lakes Alliance. Had the pleasure of working with Steve when we had a watershed academy for Clean Lakes Alliance, and we were trying to build up local leadership in our communities to take on projects and do good work in the watershed, and really sort of bring people up in terms of their education levels and what's happening with the lakes and the watershed and what different organizations like Clean Lakes Alliance can do to bring about change in the watershed. And Steve was our coordinator and MC for that whole watershed academy. He did a great job of really training the next generation of leaders in the watershed. So we appreciate that. So thanks again, Steve, for being here today. If you didn't get your question, or we're going to actually go through questions. I'm going to be turning on. Can you do that? Okay, thank you. We're going to be taking questions now from the audience. I ask that you please raise your hand. I'll run a microphone around and ask you to talk into the microphone. We do want to make sure that we record the questions and the responses because we will be putting the recording up on our YouTube channel following this presentation. It should go up, I think, in the tomorrow morning. Before we get there, I want to say that we hope to see you again. Just a reminder about our Frozen Assets Happy Hour Summit on Wednesday, February 4th. And then again, the festival on February 7th, which is that Saturday at the Edgewater. And then we'll be back here at the East Side Club in March for our March Clean Lakes 101, and we're going to learn all about effigy mounds around our shores. So you wouldn't want to miss that. So hopefully you can join us. And again, any additional information, please do use our website. We provide a lot of information on our website, and hopefully you also subscribe to our monthly Lakeogram electronic newsletter. So we're ready to go. So Jens, please. Start right here.
Only softball questions, please.
Test. Okay, so
It's really loud.
So, obviously, a lot of factors, affect ice cover. And, you talked about salinization increase, and that, I would think, would have some sort of impact. How much of an impact is that? That's basically my question, like salinization, is it being measured as far as its impact on ice cover?
That's a good question. So like ocean water has a lot of salt, right? And that does affect the density and so on. Hillary Dugan, who's a professor here at UW-Madison, she's really the lake salt expert and would know that answer. My sense is that the salt levels in the lakes are still so low that they're not having a significant effect on affecting the temperature of the freezing point. Just as an aside though, the freezing point in freshwater is 0 Celsius. It's -2 Celsius in ocean water because of the salinity effect. So it's sizable. I would be surprised if it's more than 1/10 of a degree around here. I think that, does anyone know how the salt level of the lakes are? There's still freshwater lakes.
Yeah, thank you.
On the topic of measurement,
Mhm.
looking at the climate change and the impact on weather and then the impact on lakes, are there observations that you would want or observations you would want more of that look at that topic?
Between lakes and climate?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I showed that graphic, that worldwide map at the beginning of the study that showed warming lake waters at all parts of the world. So measurements like that, I think, would be really useful. The most useful, Steve, is if you could get your satellites to go back in time and make measurements from the 1800s. But short of that, I think more comprehensive measurements of temperature, lake temperature. Of course, that's going to measure the surface, not at depth, but I think that would be especially useful, as well as measurements of lake ice, because that is something satellites can be used to detect directly.
In a slew of alarming graphs and charts that you showed, the most alarming one to me was the one about salt, the salinity of the lakes going up steadily since 1970, especially, and starting in 1940. Is there any safe amount of salt that we can put on our roads? Shouldn't we just stop salting our roads entirely?
This is where I think it gets into a question of safety. There are things that can be done, like putting sand down instead of salt. I don't know exactly what the messaging is from Clean Lakes Alliance, except that we tend to oversalt. My personal sense is that salt on pavement is a bit like salt in our diet. Like a little bit is okay, but a lot is dangerous. And I think that it's probably something like that. I salt when we had a really bad ice cover on the sidewalks. I don't want people to fall, but I make sure I use the minimal amount. And I think that at least that's something that we could all do, is try to minimize the salt use so that we get the effectiveness. You don't need much salt in order to get that effectiveness.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me as really significant was the impact of manure spreading in the spring and the runoff from that. And its contribution of phosphorus, i.e. algal growth in the lakes. What's being done? Is there any ideas on perhaps incentivizing farmers not to spread so much manure during high runoff periods? Maybe economic incentives, other things.
Yeah, I haven't followed the latest on that, but I think things like the manure digesters plural now, is one approach. Another one is there's manure injection options that farmers can use. There's a cost with that. But in terms of, we're likely to get a heavy rainfall. Don't spread manure. That messages like that could be useful. We can't anticipate heavy rainfalls as well as we can anticipate heat waves, for example, but we do have a pretty good sense that there's a major winter warm up, and we have a good sense that the moisture levels in the atmosphere are going to be high. Those are times when the potential is there for heavy rainfalls, and that's when farmers should be especially careful about their manure spreading. So I think the fact that weather forecasts have improved dramatically, we can take advantage of that, even though they'll never be perfect. And even that Milwaukee event, nobody knew that it was going to be Milwaukee as opposed to a common walk was going to be at ground zero.
I have a question about the ability of the lake to recover and bounce back. Every year we have an Ironman competition here. It comes around a week and a half into September. And for some reason, the last 3 years that I've seen, the water quality is the Chamber of Commerce quality there, where it's incredible when you see people swimming. What happens leading up to that where the lake does such a job coming back?
Yeah, I assume that it has to do with the weather conditions preceding that in part, depending on whether we get a heavy rainfall event or not. But it's certainly going to depend on temperature conditions, precipitation, rainfall conditions leading up to that event.
Next question here. What's the current projection on a climate analog state for Wisconsin? I think 2050 is the generally target date.
Yeah, so climate analog, meaning what Madison's future climate, say in the 2050s, is like the present day climate where. And definitely south of Madison. How far south, whether we're talking northern Illinois or central Illinois, is an open question. It depends on which climate model you look at. Where it gets trickier is with precipitation. And like I showed, falls are expected to become wetter, summer's drier. So you probably need to break it down season by season. If our summers become drier and hotter, more like the plains as an analog. But in winter, warmer and wetter, then we're looking more like southeast of here, more like places like Illinois, Ohio. So these analogs, I think, are really useful, not only for the future, but also the present day. That is kind of where we're looking. So more southward in every season, but then east or west, depending on whether the precipitation is going to go up or down in the future in that season.
Time for one or two more questions.
Is there an ideal number of manure digesters that we should have in this watershed?
Oh, I bet there are folks in the Clean Lakes Alliance who can answer that question better than I can. I don't really have a good sense. Most counties do not have probably one digester. So I don't know what the sweet spot is, what the optimal number is. And again, I'm balancing cost and usage with the benefits.
Are there measurements or studies that show the extent to which bioretention reduces some of that phosphorus load from the manure?
There are. One of the things that's important with these so-called natural climate solutions is measuring and monitoring the effectiveness that they have. And one of the important research outcomes is that I just come across a request for research proposals from a philanthropic organization. And in the requirements for the proposal, you have to document what the effectiveness is going to be. So the evaluation part of it, even down to the point of how much climate change in terms of what we call radiator forcing, or how much equivalent carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is that natural climate solution reducing. So essentially, how much bang for the buck are we getting from those? So I can't cite numbers or studies here, But I do know that that's considered a very important aspect. It's not enough to just say, well, it does some good. You have to document just how much good did it do and how much money went into that to do that good.
I'm really sorry, but we're out of time. But I know that, can we give Steve another round of applause? And I'm sure Steve will, be able to stick around for a few minutes, to answer additional questions. And if you happen to miss Steve today, there's a line of people wanting to ask him questions and you have to leave. Just please send your questions to info@cleanlakesalliance.org, our email address. And we'll, make sure we get those questions to Steve and he will relay those responses. So thank you.